We live in a two-tier system, one where white indigenous Brits are treated as second-class citizens in Britain. At least that's what the likes of Nigel Farage, Richard Tice, Tommy Robinson and other race baiters want you to think.
We've got two-tier politics, two-tier policing and two-tier justice. And it's a very, very dangerous, slippery road to be going down.
Last night here about whether two-tier policing exists or not. Well, I'll tell you something. There is a very widespread perception that it does.
And why has the whole two-tier argument come about? Well, that's because the narrative that these right-wing, largely anti-Muslim lot wanted you to believe in was that the violence and mayhem is caused by non-white foreigners, particularly those from Muslim countries. They have no love for Britain or their neighbourhoods they live in. They simply leech off the system while causing huge amounts of violence. And only if we could get back to the good old days where we didn't have the foreigners, we would have peace in Britain and put the great back into Great Britain. Yet that narrative was destroyed when white indigenous Brits were seen rioting across England, fighting the police, burning police cars, looting shops like Greggs and Shoe Zone amongst others, and even burning down a community library, after which some white Brits were then seen robbing the library of its computers and monitors. So the right-wing narrative has been destroyed. The claims that it's these foreigners who are mainly Muslims are the ones causing all this trouble has been shown to be a myth. It's used to stoke up divisions in society, distract the population from the real problems facing Britain by attempting to place all the blame on non-whites, immigrants and minorities. So where do they go? How do they attempt to stoke up hatred when they've been exposed with their racist narrative, which has largely been targeted against Muslims? Well, now they claim we live in a two-tier system, that foreigners, migrants, non-whites and even those Muslims have it easy even when they riot. They don't face the harsh sentences that white Brits face, or they don't face the harsh treatment from the police. That it's just so unfair that they are treated so disdainfully and unjustly compared to Muslims and immigrants. Forget about the fact that they are rioting, not just in one city but across the whole of the country. Forget about the fact that they are attempting to burn down residences, housing, asylum seekers, some of which house vulnerable children. Forget about the fact that they have hospitalized police. No, all this doesn't really matter. What matters to them is that they are facing a supposed two-tier system where their white British race rioters face harsher treatment than non-whites. Again, it's a narrative that attempts to stoke up division and hatred. It helps to keep the right-wing narrative relevant when they've been exposed as liars and propagating false news, i.e. when they attempted to blame immigrant Muslims who came over on boats for the murder and stabbing of little girls in Southport, all of which was complete lies. But what do you do when you've been exposed as a complete liar? Well, you deflect. You bait the majority of the population, which is the white Brits, into thinking that they are being disadvantaged by the system. But is this really the case? For instance, are white Brits facing harsher punishments from their riots compared to non-whites? Well, let's see if this is the case by looking at the sentencing of rioters in Bradford in the early 2000s. The background to this riot saw that Asians, mainly Muslims, attacking police and damaging buildings, including burning cars, was that there was an Asian man in Bradford that was stabbed by what was seen as a racist attack, and this came during a time where far-right thugs marched through Muslim areas in Oldham, Burnley and Bradford. These far-right marches were attempting to incite fear and a reaction from the Muslim community. Thus, what we then saw were Muslims in these towns, particularly in Bradford, which, as I mentioned, saw a stabbing of an Asian man, come out in numbers thinking they were protecting their streets as they had been failed by the police and feared for their communities. The police then attempted to disperse them out of Bradford city centre, and the result of which saw Asians begin fighting against the police. This then also resulted in shops and cars being burnt. Now, nothing can justify this violence. That's not the point. The point, however, was that there was a distinct trigger factor that led to the matrix of fear as described by Michael Mansfield, who was then a QC. However, none of the background was deemed relevant when sentencing occurred. At the time, the judge who passed the original sentences stated that he was not concerned with the origins of the violence. By the way, in a later appeal, Judge Rose, including 2 other appeal court judges, did state that the causes of violence should have been taken into consideration when it came to sentencing. So what were the sentences? Well, firstly, over 100 people were sentenced. Most had handed themselves in and pleaded guilty, yet most of them got sentenced between 4 and 6.5 years in prison. Even by their standard, it was seen as harsh. Yet now we are seeing white British race rioters also being sentenced. Now, if we were really living in a two-tier system where immigrants get it easy, then we would expect these white British to be getting far more than the 6.5 years that the Asian Bradford rioters got in the early 2000s. But what we are seeing is significantly lower sentences. Of those who have been jailed, they are getting around 32 months in prison. That's around 2.5 years in prison. Compare that to the 4 and the 6.5 years the Bradford riots got on average. It's definitely a lot less. In a couple of cases, we have now recently seen sentences of 4 to 6 years for a few white Brits, but those sentences are seen as an exception, whereas they were the norm when it was sentencing Asians, mainly Muslims, for rioting in Bradford in the early 2000s. And why is that? Because the majority of white British rioters are not being charged with rioting, but to a lesser charge of violent disorder. Only a small minority have been charged with the more serious crime of rioting. When it came to the Bradford rioters, however, the vast majority were being charged with rioting, not violent disorder. Thus, they face higher sentences in prison. So it's pretty clear that sentencing doesn't advantage non-whites, Asian immigrants or Muslims for that matter. Let's take a look at other figures, for instance, stop and searches done by the police. For every 1,000 black people in the UK, there are 24.5 stop and searches that take place. For every 1,000 Asians, it's 8.5. And for every white person, it's 5.9. So you are more likely to be stopped and searched by the police if you look like me than the white British individuals. What about the use of police force against people? Again, the race baiters like Richard Tice, etc., claim the white British get the rough end of the police truncheon when it comes to facing violence by the police. In a report in 2019-2020, if you are black, Asian or minority, it stated you would be twice as likely to face force being used against you by the police than if you were white. For black people, that's 5.7 times more likely than their white counterparts. So where's this two-tier policing that favours non-whites? You are more likely to face custodial sentences if you are non-white, with Asians facing between 16 and 21% more likely to face prison time compared to white British. And if you are black, then it's 9 to 19% more likely to face custodial sentences than being white British. This is according to a report in 2017. As you can see, whether it's sentencing to riots, non-whites got far harsher sentences. Whether it's stop and search powers enacted by the police, you're more likely to face this if you are non-white, and police are more likely to use force against you if you are non-white. And if you go to court, you're more likely to face prison sentences compared to white British people. I could go on and give numerous other stats. For instance, non-whites face higher prison sentences for comparable crimes compared to white British individuals. So why are race baiters like Richard Tice, Tommy Robinson and others trying to claim the opposite, that it's actually the white people living in the two-tier system that they are being treated more harshly? You see, they are trying to divide communities, make ordinary people think that the other communities are having it better, they get better treatment. This then feeds into the narrative that the reason why white indigenous population may be suffering from economic hardship and other types of hardship has nothing to do with the rich and powerful usurping your wealth. No, it's all about the immigrants, those Muslims, those non-whites who leech off the system. How convenient that this narrative is being pushed by the likes of Reform Party or media outlets like GB News and Talk TV, who receive large funding from those involved in the financial banking sector. For instance, Richard Tice, Reform Party MP, is a multi-millionaire, having made his money from property asset management that's listed on the London Stock Exchange. Or GB News is jointly owned by hedge fund manager Sir Paul Marshall, worth in excess of £600 million. Or people like Nigel Farage, a former City trader who receives over £1 million from GB News as a presenter. This reminds me of that meme where the greedy banker tries to warn the white working class man to be fearful of the foreigner as he'll take away all your cookies, while at the same time having all the cookies to himself. In a time of economic hardship that everyone faces, whether white, black, Asian, Muslim or whoever, those in powerful positions deflect criticisms from themselves by race baiting the majority of the population, that is the white British, by claiming the other, the minority, the Asian, the immigrant, the Muslim is the problem. Hence why you can't get a doctor's appointment, because there are just too many migrants. Why you can't get housing, it's because it goes to those asylum seekers. Why is your energy bill keep increasing? It's because the foreigners are causing it somehow.
Immigration is the number one issue in British politics. They're seeing the impact on local schools, They're seeing the impact on GP services. They're seeing the impact on housing or the inability of young people to get on the housing ladder.
The fact is, this is false, just like the claims that there is a two-tier system. Don't be fooled. Don't be played as idiots. Educate yourselves, because the reality is the reason for this isn't the minorities in this country. No, it's the rich and powerful who seek to maintain their riches and status by gaslighting you to think it's the foreigners who are the problem. You need to wake up and stop being played by these race baiters.